Because we've got a little bit less time, we're going to just jump right into it. Natalia, if you can advance to just the next slide. So what we're talking about here is very much a future that we're already seeing in terms of more of hotter, more frequent heat waves in Prince George's County. We've seen this all across the country this summer. July was the hottest month on record on the planet. Portland, Oregon had temperatures of 107 degrees, which is just out of this world. And we can expect to encounter this in Prince George's County in the future. And how are we going to, how are folks going to adapt? How is the county going to ensure that residents vulnerable residents are not subject to these extreme heat events? So, so far the county has been providing residents about how to avoid heat-related illnesses. Green roofs have been installed at newer developments around the county, and the county has a tree canopy program, a tree planting program, which is key. You know, nature has the greatest infrastructure in trees that's out there. They do so many wonderful things, including mitigating the urban heat island effect. So those are some things that the county is already doing. Natalia, if you can advance to the next slide. So tonight we're talking about specific strategies that the county has heard from in previous sessions and has started to put into their blueprint for this specific action. And that includes conducting thermal mapping. So doing a mapping of tree canopy cover, shade study, and mapping out aerial utilities, because the more utility lines that you can bury, the more you can plant trees in their place. The other is conducting a heat vulnerability assessment. So this is a neighborhood level assessment of demographics to see which populations are most vulnerable. Having robust stakeholder engagement in terms of developing and prioritizing heat mitigation and adaptation opportunities. And then finalizing these strategies. And then a big one at the end is specific code revisions. So specifically, what can the county do within its legal parameters to require certain things to be done throughout the county as it relates to primarily development. So we're going to jump right into the first question. And you folks have already just been in a breakout room, so you kind of know how this works. So as it relates to this topic that we're talking about here, how do we reduce the exposure of vulnerable populations to extreme heat? What hurdles would need to be cleared to achieve success for this specific blueprint? So the way we'll do it is, if you raise your hand, I will call on you and you can verbally comment or ask a question. You can also put a comment or question in the chat box, which we will be monitoring. And that's pretty much it. So first off, we are going to call on Denise, who has raised her hand. Denise, go right ahead with your comment or question.
Great, thank you. I think my comment would be that a lot of the vulnerable communities are the first ones to be exposed to extreme heat, and a lot of the mainly of the vulnerable communities are can be made up of minority groups, some of them which might not have the access to all the lines of communications between like state agencies or organizations and them. So creating those networks so that they feel comfortable in speaking and learning more about all the ways that they can get notifications so that they can be part of this process. I think that would be part of creating a successful blueprint. And then from the county's viewpoint, I would say also partnering up with local on the ground nonprofits and organizations that can deliver these messages as well. And kind of creating and fostering that community trust between the community members, the agencies, and the organizations.
Excellent. Thank you, Denise. If anybody would else like to comment or pose a question, go right ahead. If you don't know how to, if you can raise your hand, that would be great. If not, you can just shout it out. That's all right too. or put it in the chat box. We have a couple comments. Let's see. The importance of multilingual communications. Absolutely. That goes for virtually everything that will be talked about for this climate action plan, I would say. Linda mentioned that health programs that promote walking and wellness as lifestyle should be involved. Fitter people will be better able to avoid being vulnerable. Certainly, certainly. Any other comments or questions about what hurdles need to be cleared to achieve this kind of success in terms of reducing harm to vulnerable populations? Okay. Well, should I just mention some of the things? We'll just spark a little bit of comments maybe. Some of the things that the county is trying to implement is doing mapping of tree canopy and shade within the county. That's something that and also aerial utility mapping. So I'm sure many of you have seen trees that have been pruned back pretty severely by utility companies. What we're trying to do is figure out where those utility lines are so that they can be buried and trees can be planted instead that can grow to their mature height. What about the vulnerability assessment? That's something that people at the neighborhood scale can play a role in. Would anybody like to comment on that? How you might be able to assist with a vulnerability assessment of your neighborhood or your community? Okay.
Maybe just talking with the community members themselves, like having one-to-one conversations. Again, going back to this part of building trust with the community members,
Yeah,
so they can share their feedback as well.
absolutely. Thanks, Denise. And we've got a couple comments. So it's important, Janet noted, to stop cutting down the trees that we have. I wasn't in on the tree discussion, but I'm sure that was probably a big part of it. And the county is proposing a no net loss policy, I think. So improving interagency communication, more swimming pools. So that's something that we can talk about. You know, what can the county provide in terms of facilities that will allow people to mitigate this extreme heat? Swimming pools or cooling centers. Those would be a couple of ideas. Cutting down on impermeable surfaces, or I guess maybe surfaces that absorb heat. So there's a lot of techniques that are available in terms of roofs and sidewalks, basically white roofs that reflect the heat instead of absorb it. There are a lot of black tar roofs out there that could be converted to cool roofs or white roofs. So the importance of listening sessions so that residents can tell the county what their community needs. Absolutely, that's what we're doing here tonight. And I have no doubt that that will be a component of everything going forward. Oh, sorry, Madison, you have your hand up. So go right ahead, Madison, comment or question, please.
Great, thank you. I'm going to put in the chat, I was in this group last time. I work for the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm not an expert on climate, but I did find this great blog that might be helpful. And it talks a lot about what we already said, but the reflecting, and even this idea of cool corridors. So thinking of trees in very specific places where people walk the most. And also a lot of, we have a new report about people who work outside, because if you think about, you know, who is vulnerable are the people who probably either don't have air conditioning where they spend most of their days inside, or that they spend most of their days outside. So not really sure how to address that, but for all the people in our county who work outside, I think they're the ones who really should be listened to and have their needs really prioritized in this discussion.
Okay, great. I want to make sure that we get through the 3 different questions that we've got here. So if there's any other comments about this specific question, go right ahead. Otherwise, we're going to advance to the next slide and the next question. And so drilling down, what sorts of specific tools or resources or technical assistance do you and your neighbors and your community need to get involved in this process? So thinking more granularly, what can you utilize, you know, personally, or your green team, or your HOA association? What sorts of assistance can the county or other resources provide to you? Okay, well, let's think about, so does anybody represent, oh, go ahead, Romy. Have I got that right, Romy?
Yes, you did.
Go right ahead.
Thank you so much. I think one of the myths that we have heard about is that minority communities are not interested in issues around the environment. The work we have been doing across the county at the Family Tree Adoption Program is actually demonstrating that that is not true. So I think it is important for the county to consider genuine and honest strategies for engaging minority communities. And that includes African-American communities, Hispanic communities, immigrant communities, and bring issues around the environment using terminologies that they understand. We have seen that when you make the connection between the environment, for instance, between trees and health, the engagement increases. But when we talk about the environment just in a way that it does not resonate with these communities that are, low socioeconomic status, low education, or other things, then we lose them. So I think the county should consider a very genuine strategy in engaging minority communities.
Okay, thank you, Romy. Anyone else? Raise your hand or just shout out, that's okay too. We have a comment from Carrie. Some members in our community do not have a strong support system to check on them when things go wrong. Could we set up a network to support people who need someone to proactively check on them? That sounds like a good idea to me. And I suppose, there are other things that the county can do. And yeah, a buddy system, right? I think many of you got an alert on your phone yesterday about the tornado warning. So something similar, I think, could be done in terms of, if it's not already, in terms of heat warnings and information that can be pushed out to communities that way. Okay, any other thoughts on this? Come on, folks, you came to this session. You must have an interest. Put your thinking caps on. How about, oh, sorry, we have a comment. Heat advisories might not get to those without internet access. Good point, absolutely. The other thing that we mentioned were specific code revisions. So requiring green roofs or cool roofs, requiring street tree spacing from 50 feet to 30 feet maximum, sidewalk repairs in terms of creating reflective sidewalks.
Mike, we have a hand up.
Oh, sorry, thank you. Kim, go right ahead.
Thank you. Just wanted to mention, I know the county's food security task force will be, if they haven't already, providing some recommendations, related to our most vulnerable residents in Prince George's County. So I'm just wondering if there may be some cross-pollination with some of those recommendations. I know one of the things that they're proposing is an Office of Food Security, and potentially a food director. So maybe there's some, parallels and some intersections here that could, benefit both.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Kim. Okay. Any other, oh, sorry, Denise, go right ahead. You have to unmute. Yep.
Creating sort of like a task force and a work group with community members so that they can also provide their input in the decision-making process.
Okay. So what other resources could your, just, thinking about your community, where you live, whether it's a homeowners association, a municipality, your street, your block, Janet mentioned a buddy system. That's certainly something that can be used on the neighborhood scale. But, what what about the larger pictures that, you know, how about advocating for the county to do certain things like burying utility lines? You know, how can you as an individual or your community members, how can you get engaged in that conversation?
One thing we can do is save trees, a tree canopy, because that reduces the temperature by 10 degrees.
Okay, so preserving the tree canopy, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
And restoring it.
thank you. Is that Mark?
Yes.
Thank you, Mark.
I think it goes back to what a lot of the members have already said in this session breakout room, is making anything relatable to the community members. So whether it be canopy and how it reduces urban heat island effects, or like how there will be some sort of health or economic benefit for themselves, for their families, for the environment. I think making those connections and kind of making those the kind of targeted messages, I think that would kind of get the community's buy-in and interest.
Okay.
I'd like to make a comment that this last legislative session, the state passed a law that HOAs can no longer stop you from restoring a native tree canopy. The law is now on our side. I can send that information if you send me an email to send it to share.
Okay, Mark, that would be great. If you could put it in the chat box while we're here, that would be great too, if you find a link. But we've got that noted in the notes.
Okay.
Okay, any other comments in terms of resources that you might need? Otherwise, we'll go to the final question.
I just want to throw in one more thing there. And I just, this has to do with getting the health department engaged in both an education piece and an outreach, the community piece. I mean, we talk a lot about infrastructure, but we don't talk enough about taking care of the people. And this whole heat thing is probably the most important part of the climate problem that is it's going to kill people. I mean, people are going to die because of heat. And we saw that in Oregon and other places across the world just this year. It's not later, it's now. And we don't really have a system, even though, okay, yes, every once in a while, a Tuesday tip talks about staying well hydrated. It's not really sufficient for, it doesn't include things like educating first aiders and first responders to recognize when somebody is having a heat-related illness, if they're confused or agitated. Maybe that's because they're dehydrated and about to have a heat stroke, you know? And so we need the population to be better educated to recognize these problems and to help each other. And anyway, I mean, I'm all for, you know, planting more trees and having more green roofs and things, but I think that needs to be in addition to, not instead of, educating the population about how to take care of each other better. And that includes neighborhood systems for neighbors checking on neighbors. And, you know, when the power goes out, what do? Where do you go to get cool when there's no electricity? Where do you go for clean water when there's a problem? Anyway, these health systems need to be integrated into this in addition to the infrastructure stuff.
Thank you very much, Janet. Great points and a good reminder.
Following what Janet said, one of the most practical things to do is to make sure where people are at risk of heat strokes is they have plenty of water or watermelon or whatever, plenty to drink. And they may, with the power loss and all, they may not just have that. So we got to make sure that everybody has enough water. I go out in the field every day at even 90 degrees and I have plenty to drink to make up for my loss of water with sweat. It works.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And we have a couple comments in the chat box. Can the county remove asphalt where it is no longer needed? And I'm wondering if the solar canopies like the one in IKEA also help the area to be cooler. Certainly the county can decide to remove asphalt where it is no longer needed. And the solar canopies like the one in IKEA do actually help keep the sun off the pavement, which absorbs the heat. And so the panels themselves are doing the absorption of the heat. How are diabetics impacted by heat more than non-diabetics? I'm not sure, probably more so. And Janet's had a great reminder about the two sides of the equation here. We're talking about, yes, infrastructure in terms of trees and green roofs and white roofs and solar reflective pavement and sidewalks, but also the education and outreach component is equally key. Okay, I think we have probably about 8 minutes left. I want to make sure that we get to the final question. And again, thinking sort of broadly and out into the sort of near to medium term, we're talking about goals for 2030 here, but in the next 3 to 5 years, what specific things need to happen in order for the county to show progress on this blueprint? And go ahead, you can put them in the chat box, you can call them out, you can raise your hand. Let's get into specifics. What specific things need to happen?
Denise, you can go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I guess, as someone else previously mentioned, heat is going to unfortunately cause a lot of deaths and heat strokes. So by kind of measuring like how much education and outreach is done to communities versus how do we see these numbers of deaths and heat strokes being reduced, if we can kind of find a correlation of that over the period of time. And also finding data on how much tree canopy and forest cover is actually reducing heat in certain areas over time.
Okay, thank you, Denise. So definitely an important thing will be to have the county do a complete inventory in terms of mapping tree canopy, in terms of studying shade, and in terms of mapping aerial utilities. Okay, it sounds like we're in agreement that that's a priority.
And on Janet's point that she just made, did you see that?
Janet mentioned, I'll just read it for everybody. Janet mentioned that heat mapping and maps of tree canopy will help target future efforts. Yes, absolutely. Oh, and replacing natural grass, stop replacing natural grass athletic fields with artificial turf. One of those comments, Mark?
Yeah, that second one. And the HOA law that was just passed, HOAs can no longer force you to have lawns. You can have, like every other home in Hyattsville, in my daughter's house, it's now a natural ecosystem, and that reduces stormwater runoff by 14-fold. And because the complex ecosystem with different root niches holds the water and releases it slowly. So HOAs can no longer, the law is now on our side. Okay. So I'll send that HOA bill, and it's exciting.
That's great. I was just noting in the previous electric vehicle conversation that Maryland just passed a right to charge at HOAs. So homeowners have a right to install electric vehicle charging stations. It sounds like HOAs have made a lot of progress recently in Maryland. A couple of other comments, and we have 4 minutes left. So if you do have a comment, please let us know now before our time runs out. I'll read a few things in the chat box. It's important to clearly define the population of vulnerable people and segment them by the vulnerability index so that we don't address this with one size fits all. And that's certainly a key part of the blueprint, to conduct a heat vulnerability assessment at the neighborhood scale. The county should track when employees die of heat on the job. Death from heat is avoidable, and we should be looking out to make sure all employers are doing what they should. Energy efficiency for households to decrease energy bills, right? So air conditioning in the summertime during extreme heat is expensive. Any other things that need to happen in the next 3 to 5 years for this to be a successful blueprint?
One other idea is creating job transitions so that people that perhaps work outdoors can have other options of perhaps working indoors, and so that they're not exposed to the outdoors, and or creating policies that will perhaps help their employers kind of assess the situation. If the heat is too high, then they have some flexibility around the work they do and when they do it, and kind of avoid kind of those peak heat times outdoors.
You're talking about not outdoors in the woods, but outdoors
Like in the full heat, like for
in
instance,
the heat.
construction workers,
right,
that
right.
most of them are like outside.
Or public works folks, you know,
Yes.
people who are collecting trash and recycling and that sort of thing. The idea would be to ensure that their exposure is limited in terms of bringing them inside for some tasks, and not having them be outdoors all day. That's what you mean, Denise?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
At least having cooling breaks and adequate water and ways to cool off while also getting the work done, or shorter
Sure.
shift.
Okay.
And higher pay for hazardous work.
All right. That deserves its own bullet point, I think. Higher pay for hazardous work.
I'd like to make a point that, in my experience, people who are suffering from heat exposure, who are going to be suffering from heat exhaustion or heat stroke, are uniquely bad at recognizing their own vulnerability in that moment.
Yes.
So when people are getting too hot, it is not appropriate to expect them to do the reaching out, that we have to plan ahead for who's going to get too hot and find opportunities to monitor them, so that because when you start to get too hot, you lose that brain function to be able, you don't even recognize what's going on.
So you'll call them every hour and say, did you have your watermelon? Did you drink your water?
Yeah, obviously that's unreasonable. We can't have people calling everybody every hour, but you know what I mean? Like, I bet there are things that we can do to sort of check in on the people that we know are especially vulnerable, or like
Right.
the buddy system or something like that.
And putting people on schedules, or having schedule breaks every 2 hours, or something reasonable, and
Okay.
having a buddy system so that people can keep an eye on each other, and having everybody recognize in each other, oh, Mark always gets like that when he's too hot. Let's cool him down.
We also have to be conscious that a lot of the times, like for instance, back to my example of construction workers, they might not be have a legal status in the US. So also working through those barriers of, making sure that information gets disseminated to them when perhaps they're so afraid of even talking with agencies because of their status. But it's a public health risk. And I think that's why bringing in various departments, county agencies really makes sense to kind of disseminate this information, and also working with community-based organizations.
Okay. Thank you very much, Denise. And I think we're gonna wrap this up. We have about a minute left, and I want to thank everybody for coming to this evening's meeting and coming to the